At some point, you started choosing quiet over honesty. Not because you didn't care, and not because you were afraid of conflict. You did it because when you spoke up, it didn't land the way it should have. When you said something bothered you, it got questioned. When you explained how you felt, you were told you were reading it wrong. Sometimes you were told you misunderstood what was said. Other times, it turned into a discussion about your tone instead of what you were trying to say. After a while, you learned something without meaning to. Speaking up created tension. Staying quiet kept things smooth. So you adjusted. You thought you were being reasonable. You told yourself it was better to let small things go than to argue. You told yourself that staying calm was the mature choice. And at first, that probably felt true. But something changed while you were doing that. You started feeling tense even when nothing was wrong. You noticed that you were thinking through every word before you said it. You caught yourself holding things back, not because they didn't matter, but because you didn't want to deal with what came after. Keeping the peace slowly turned into work. No one directly told you to stay quiet, but every time you spoke honestly and it got dismissed, corrected, or turned back on you, the message was clear. It wasn't safe to say things the way you felt them. It was easier to soften them, or not say them at all. So you adapted. You said less. You chose your moments carefully. You waited for better timing that never really came. And over time, you started carrying more of the relationship inside your own head instead of sharing it. From the outside, things probably looked calm, maybe even stable. But inside, you were doing a lot of work just to keep things from tipping. You were managing reactions. You were preventing tension. You were shrinking parts of yourself to keep things running smoothly. That's the cost people don't talk about. Keeping the peace isn't free. Someone always pays for it. And in this situation, it was you. You paid with constant tension, with second-guessing yourself, with the quiet feeling that you were slowly disappearing from your own life. If this feels familiar, it's not because you failed to communicate. It's because the way your honesty was met taught you to protect the relationship by silencing yourself. That explains why things feel the way they do now. What you're feeling now isn't confusion in the way people usually mean it. It's more like weariness, a quiet kind of tired that doesn't go away with rest. You didn't just go through something difficult. You spent a long time holding yourself back. Keeping the peace took effort. It wasn't automatic. Every time you noticed something felt off and decided not to say it, that cost you something. Every time you chose calm over honesty, you made a small trade, one you probably didn't notice at first. You weren't trying to disappear. You were trying to keep things from getting harder. When you saw that speaking up led to tension, defensiveness, or long conversations that went nowhere, you learned to pause. You learned to weigh your words. You learned to ask yourself whether it was really worth bringing something up. That kind of self-control looks reasonable from the outside. People often praise it. They call it being mature or easygoing. But living that way for a long time pulls your attention inward. You start monitoring yourself instead of expressing yourself. That's exhausting. It makes sense that you feel drained now. It makes sense if you feel emotionally flat or disconnected, like you don't quite know what you want to say anymore. When you spend a long time choosing not to speak, your system doesn't just switch back on the moment the pressure lifts. You might also struggle to name what hurts because nothing was dramatic. There wasn't always shouting or obvious conflict. A lot of it happened quietly, but quiet pressure still leaves marks. Holding yourself back day after day changes how you feel about your place in a relationship.
So if you feel tired in a way that's hard to explain, or if you feel like you lost some part of your energy along the way, that reaction fits what you lived through. You weren't just being calm. You were carrying the cost of that calm on your own.
When you look back now, it's easy to turn on yourself. You might think you should have spoken up more. You might tell yourself that a stronger person wouldn't have stayed quiet, or that if you really valued yourself, you wouldn't have accepted that role. But that way of thinking skips over what was actually happening. You didn't stay quiet because you didn't matter. You stayed quiet because being honest made things harder. Each time you tried to say what you felt and it led to defensiveness, correction, or tension, you learned something. You learned that peace depended on restraint. Over time, that restraint can start to feel like who you are instead of something you're doing. You become the calm one, the understanding one, the one who doesn't make things difficult. And because that role keeps things running, it often goes unchallenged. But there's a cost to that role. When your value starts to feel tied to how little trouble you cause, you slowly stop checking in with yourself. You stop asking what you want or need. You start measuring yourself by how smoothly things go instead of how honest you're allowed to be. That shift can make it feel like something is wrong with you when you finally notice the loss. But the loss didn't happen because you lacked confidence or strength. It happened because you adapted to a situation that worked best when you stayed small. That adaptation doesn't define your worth. Your self-worth didn't disappear while you were keeping the peace. It just got set aside while you focused on maintaining stability. Anyone who stays in a dynamic like that for long enough will do some version of the same thing. Separating your worth from what happened means recognizing that your silence was a strategy, not a failure. You weren't choosing quiet because you didn't have a voice. You were choosing it because using your voice came with consequences you were tired of paying. Seeing that clearly allows you to stop turning that adaptation into a judgment about who you are. It helps you understand that what you lost wasn't your value. It was the freedom to express yourself without weighing the cost every time. After something like this, your emotions don't make clean sense. One day you feel calm. The next day you feel irritated or restless for no clear reason. Sometimes you miss the person. Other times you feel relieved they're not around. That mix can make you feel like you don't know yourself anymore. But that confusion didn't come from nowhere. When you spend a long time managing someone else's reactions, your emotions stop moving freely. You don't just feel what you feel. You check it first. You ask yourself whether it's reasonable. You think about how it might land. That habit doesn't disappear just because the relationship changes or ends. So now, even in quiet moments, your system is still on alert. You might feel guilty for wanting distance, especially if the other person wasn't always unkind. You might remember good moments and start questioning whether you're being unfair. You might even feel tempted to downplay what happened, because part of you learned that naming problems caused trouble. That pull is normal. It doesn't mean you imagine things. It comes from being in a situation where your feelings were often met with resistance. When someone regularly responded to your honesty by correcting you, minimizing it, or shifting the focus back onto you, it trained you to doubt your own reactions. That training doesn't shut off instantly. At the same time, it's important not to confuse understanding with excusing. Just because the confusion makes sense doesn't mean the pattern was okay. Wanting peace doesn't justify being silenced. Staying calm doesn't mean staying quiet should have been required. You can acknowledge that you cared about the person and still be honest about how their responses affected you. You can miss them and still recognize that the dynamic asked too much of you. Those things don't cancel each other out. Confusion often shows up when you're caught between what you felt then and what you see now. Back then, you were focused on getting through the moment without tension. Now you're seeing the cost of that strategy. that shift can feel disorienting. What matters is not forcing yourself to feel one way or another. It's letting your reactions exist without using them to rewrite the past. Feeling sad doesn't mean the situation was healthy. Feeling relieved doesn't mean it didn't matter. Your emotions are responses to what you lived through. They're not instructions to return to silence or to excuse what wore you down. Learning to hold that distinction takes time, but each time you notice it, you're getting clearer. And clarity doesn't come from pushing feelings away. It comes from letting them be there, without letting them decide what you tolerate again. This is the part where things get clearer, even if that clarity isn't comfortable. Because once you stop explaining everything away, you start seeing the relationship for what it actually required from you. At some point, keeping the peace became your responsibility. Not officially, not out loud, but in practice. When something felt off, you were the one expected to adjust. When tension showed up, you were the one who tried to smooth it over. When a conversation got uncomfortable, it was usually you who backed down first. That didn't happen by accident. Each time you raised a concern and it was met with defensiveness, correction, or dismissal, a pattern was reinforced. You learned that bringing things up caused problems. You learned that staying quiet kept things running. Over time, that shifted the balance of the relationship. It meant that your comfort became optional, while calm became the priority. It's important to say this plainly. A relationship where peace only exists when one person stays quiet is not balanced. Even if there were good moments, even if the other person didn't see themselves as doing anything wrong, the outcome still matters. Another hard truth is this: you stayed longer than you should have. Not because you were weak, but because you kept hoping the dynamic would change. You thought that if you found the right words, or waited for the right moment, things would finally feel easier. They didn't. And that's not because you failed to communicate. It's because the problem wasn't clarity. It was that your honesty was often treated as an inconvenience instead of something to be met. You also need to be honest about the cost. You didn't just give up arguments. You gave up parts of yourself. You learned to pause before reacting. You learned to swallow thoughts that mattered to you. You learned to accept a version of calm that came at your expense. That's not a small thing. Facing these truths doesn't mean turning the other person into a villain. It means acknowledging that the relationship worked best when you carried more than your share. And that kind of arrangement always takes something from the person doing the carrying. Seeing that clearly is painful, but it's also grounding. It pulls you out of self-blame and puts the focus back on what the relationship actually asked of you. And once you see that, it becomes harder to unsee it. That clarity is not meant to punish you. It's meant to protect you from repeating the same pattern again. After stepping out of a situation like this, being alone can feel harder than you expected. Not just quiet, but uncomfortable. You might notice the silence more. You might feel restless or unsure what to do with yourself, even when nothing is actually wrong. That reaction makes sense. For a long time, your attention was focused outward. You were watching moods. You were managing reactions. You were thinking ahead to avoid tension. Even when the relationship was draining, it filled your mental space. When that stops, the absence can feel heavy. This kind of loneliness isn't always about missing the person. Often it's about missing the structure you were used to. You were responding, adjusting, and monitoring. Being alone removes all of that at once, and your system doesn't know what to do yet. You might also feel tempted to reach out, not because you want to reconnect, but because quiet feels unsettling. When you've spent a long time keeping things smooth, silence can feel like something is wrong, even when it isn't. It's important to notice that urge without acting on it right away. Part of what makes loneliness heavier now is that you're no longer distracting yourself by managing someone else. You're sitting with your own thoughts again. And some of those thoughts are about what you put aside to keep the peace. That can feel empty at first. But this kind of withdrawal is not a sign that you made a mistake. It's more like decompression. Your system is stepping down from constant alertness. That takes time. You don't need to rush to fill the space. You don't need to replace the relationship immediately or prove that you're fine. Letting the quiet exist for a while helps you hear yourself again, without interruption or correction. Being alone after this kind of dynamic isn't a failure. It's a reset. And resets often feel uncomfortable before they feel steady. This is where things start to shift. Not because everything suddenly feels better, but because you're no longer powerless in it. Not powerless over what already happened, but over what happens next. You didn't create the dynamic that taught you to stay quiet. You didn't imagine the pressure. You responded to what was actually happening. But now that you can see it more clearly, you have a choice about whether you keep carrying it forward. Responsibility here doesn't mean blaming yourself. It means noticing the habits you picked up and deciding which ones you want to keep. You learn to pause before speaking. You learn to soften your reactions. You learn to smooth things over when something felt off. Those habits made sense then. They protected you in a situation where honesty came with consequences. But they don't need to run your life now. One of the most important choices you get to make is what you do the next time something feels wrong. In the past, that feeling was often followed by self-correction. You told yourself it wasn't a big deal. You explained it away. You adjusted before anyone asked you to. Now, responsibility looks like stopping there. Not rushing to explain. Not rushing to calm things down. Letting the feeling exist long enough to take it seriously. That might mean saying less instead of more. It might mean not defending yourself when you know what you meant. It might mean letting someone be uncomfortable instead of trying to fix it for them. Those choices can feel wrong at first, especially if you're used to being the one who keeps things smooth. But discomfort isn't the same as danger. You don't need to become distant or hard to protect yourself. You don't need to swing to the other extreme. Responsibility here is quieter than that. It's about staying with your own experience instead of talking yourself out of it. You're allowed to trust your reactions again. If something feels familiar in the wrong way, you don't need proof or a perfect explanation. You can notice the pattern and choose differently. What happens next doesn't depend on you getting everything right. It depends on you being willing to pause when that old urge to keep the peace shows up. That pause is where your agency lives now. You can't change how the past relationship worked, but you can decide that your future ones won't depend on you shrinking yourself to keep them stable. At this point, you don't need to replay everything again. You've already seen enough to understand that keeping the peace cost you more than you realized. You don't need to punish yourself for that. You were doing the best you could with what you understood at the time. What matters now is that you don't keep paying the same price. You don't have to become confrontational. You don't have to turn every feeling into a conversation. And you don't have to prove anything to anyone. What you do need is to stay on your own side when something feels off, instead of immediately stepping away from yourself to keep things smooth. That means letting some tension exist without rushing to fix it. It means allowing someone else to be uncomfortable if honesty creates friction. It means noticing when calm depends on your silence and choosing not to offer that silence anymore. Those choices won't always feel confident at first. They may feel awkward or unfamiliar, but they are how you stop turning your needs into something optional
This experience doesn't get to define you, but it does get to inform you. It shows you what happens when peace is maintained by one person alone, and it gives you a clearer sense of what you're no longer willing to trade away. You're not responsible for how that relationship worked, but you are responsible for what you accept going forward. Staying loyal to yourself doesn't require drama, it requires consistency. And remember, what happened to you wasn't your fault, but what happens next is your responsibility. Take care.